Clara Whitmore had rehearsed the sentence in her mind at least 20 times before she finally said it aloud. "Act like you love me, please." The words trembled out of her mouth in front of half the ballroom. For one horrifying second, nobody moved. The orchestra continued playing softly in the background while crystal chandeliers glowed above the polished marble floor of the Grand Halston Hotel. Wealthy investors laughed near the stage. Waiters carried silver trays between guests dressed in expensive gowns and tailored suits. And standing directly across from Clara was the last person she had ever wanted to see again. Elliot Graves. The man who had once promised her forever. The man who had walked away the moment her life became difficult. Elliot stood beside a glamorous woman in a shimmering black dress, one arm wrapped proudly around her waist. He looked successful now, confident, polished, admired. The same man who used to sit beside Clara on a tiny apartment balcony dreaming about building a future together now barely looked at her with recognition. But the humiliation wasn't coming from Elliot alone. It came from the whispers surrounding them. From the expensive people staring at Clara's simple dress. From the knowledge that she didn't belong here. And most painfully of all, from the pity in Elliot's eyes. Clara swallowed hard and turned toward the tall man standing beside her. Nathaniel Ashford. CEO of Ashford International. One of the wealthiest businessmen in London. A man so reserved that newspapers called him the marble executive because nobody had ever seen him display emotion in public. Clara had met him exactly 12 minutes earlier. And now she was begging him for help. "Please," she whispered again, quieter this time. "Just for a minute." Nathaniel looked down at her carefully. Most people would have laughed awkwardly or walked away. Some would have refused out of pride. Others would have taken advantage of the desperation in her voice. But Nathaniel only studied her face. Not the makeup she'd rushed to apply. Not the borrowed dress she kept nervously adjusting. Not the embarrassment burning in her eyes. He noticed something else. Dignity. Even standing on the edge of humiliation, she was trying not to break. Behind them, Elliot gave a small smirk. "Clara," he said loudly enough for others to hear, "you don't need to pretend you know people here." The sentence landed like a slap. Clara felt her cheeks heat instantly. She wished the floor would open beneath her. 3 years ago, Elliot had loved her when they were both struggling university students. But when Clara's mother became ill and Clara left school to support her family, everything changed. Elliot slowly drifted toward wealthier circles, better opportunities, more ambitious friends. And eventually, he drifted away from her entirely. Now he looked at her like she represented a version of his life he wanted erased. Nathaniel's gaze shifted toward Elliot. Then, without warning, the billionaire executive gently placed his hand around Clara's trembling fingers. The ballroom quieted almost immediately. Nathaniel Ashford never touched anyone publicly. Yet there he stood, calm and composed, looking at Clara as though she truly mattered. "There you are," Nathaniel said smoothly. "I've been looking for you." Clara blinked. The warmth in his voice sounded astonishingly real. Elliot's expression changed at once. "You know Mr. Ashford?" he asked. Nathaniel answered before Clara could speak. "Know her?" His tone remained polite, but firm. "Clara is the reason I came tonight." The silence around them deepened. Clara stared at him, stunned. She knew he was helping her. She knew it was an act. But somehow, the kindness in his eyes made the performance feel genuine. Elliot laughed nervously. "I think there's been some confusion." Nathaniel finally looked directly at him. "No confusion at all." The orchestra music drifted through the room again while Elliot's confident posture slowly weakened. His girlfriend looked between them with visible confusion. And Clara, who had entered the ballroom feeling invisible, suddenly found herself standing beside the most powerful man in the room. Nathaniel turned toward her gently. "Would you dance with me?" She almost said no. Not because she didn't want to. Because she was afraid. Afraid of looking foolish. afraid of ruining whatever strange miracle had just happened. But Nathaniel's expression carried no mockery. Only patience. So Clara nodded. And moments later, she found herself moving slowly across the dance floor under the soft golden lights of the ballroom. "You really didn't have to do this," she whispered. "Yes," Nathaniel replied quietly. "I did." She looked up at him in confusion. He gave a faint smile. "Nobody deserves to be spoken to like that." The music swelled around them. Clara tried not to cry. For months, life had felt unbearably heavy. She worked 2 jobs while caring for her recovering mother and younger brother. Every day felt like survival. She had attended the charity gala only because her friend Amelia had given her a spare staff invitation after another guest cancelled. Clara had hoped for one evening where she could feel normal again. Instead, she had walked directly into her past. "You don't even know me," she murmured. Nathaniel looked thoughtful for a moment. "Sometimes," he said, "you can tell more about a person from how they're hurting than from how they're performing." The sentence stayed with her long after the dance ended. Nathaniel remained beside her for the rest of the evening. Not dramatically. Not possessively. Simply, kindly. He introduced her to people without making her feel inferior. He asked about her interests. He listened when she spoke. He treated her with the same respect he offered ambassadors and executives. And slowly, Clara relaxed. By the end of the night, she had almost forgotten Elliot existed. Almost. As guests began leaving the ballroom, Clara stepped outside onto the hotel terrace for fresh air. London city lights stretched endlessly beyond the river while cool evening air brushed against her face. "You handled yourself well tonight." The voice behind her instantly ruined the peace. "Elliot." Clara closed her eyes briefly before turning around. "What do you want?" He shoved his hands into his pockets awkwardly. "To understand what's going on." She gave a tired laugh. "Why does it matter?" "Because Nathaniel Ashford doesn't date women like." He stopped himself too late. "Like me?" Clara finished quietly. Elliot sighed. "That's not what I meant." But it was. And they both knew it. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Elliot's expression softened slightly. "You used to dream bigger," he said. "You were going to become an architect." Clara looked away toward the city lights. "I also used to believe people stayed." The words hit harder than she intended. Elliot's face tightened with guilt. Before he could answer, another voice interrupted calmly. "She still dreams bigger." Nathaniel had stepped onto the terrace. Elliot straightened immediately. Nathaniel walked toward Clara and removed his jacket, gently placing it over her shoulders against the cold evening air. Such a small gesture. Yet nobody had cared for her so naturally in years. Nathaniel looked toward Elliot with quiet composure. "Good night." It wasn't rude. But it was final. Elliot hesitated before eventually walking away. Clara released a shaky breath once he disappeared. "You keep rescuing me," she said softly. Nathaniel stood beside her overlooking the river. "No," he replied. "I think you've been rescuing yourself for a very long time." The honesty in his voice unsettled her. Because part of her wanted to believe him. Nathaniel drove her home himself that evening. Not in a dramatic limousine with photographers waiting outside. Just a quiet ride through London streets while soft jazz played low through the speakers. When they arrived at Clara's small building, she immediately felt embarrassed again. The paint around the entrance was chipped. One balcony leaned slightly crooked. The neighborhood was safe but worn down by time and neglect. She reached for the door quickly. "Thank you for tonight." Nathaniel glanced toward the apartment building. "You live here with your family?" She nodded carefully. "My mother and younger brother." He noticed the hesitation in her voice. "Clara," he said gently, "there's nothing wrong with honest struggle." She looked at him then. Really looked at him. Most wealthy people she had encountered wore kindness like a temporary costume. But Nathaniel's compassion seemed deeply rooted, almost instinctive. "Why are you being nice to me?" she asked quietly. Nathaniel paused. And for the first time all evening, he looked uncertain. "Because," he admitted slowly, "I know what it feels like to stand in a room full of people and still feel alone." That answer stayed with her long after she entered her apartment. The following morning, Clara assumed she would never see Nathaniel Ashford again. People like him belonged to another world. A world of private meetings, luxury offices, and lives scheduled months ahead. Not tiny kitchens with flickering lights and overdue utility bills. So when someone knocked on her apartment door at 9 in the morning, Nathaniel Ashford was the absolute last person she expected to find standing there. Her younger brother Oliver nearly dropped his cereal bowl. "Why is there a millionaire at our door?" Clara stared speechlessly. Nathaniel stood holding a paper bag from a local bakery. "I hope this isn't too early," he said. Her mother appeared from the hallway wearing a cardigan and immediately froze. Nathaniel smiled politely. "I brought breakfast." 30 minutes later, the impossible scene somehow became even stranger. Nathaniel Ashford sat at their tiny kitchen table drinking tea while Oliver excitedly talked about football. And Nathaniel listened seriously. Not distracted. Not impatient. Present. Clara watched him quietly from across the table, unable to understand why he was there. Eventually, her mother Evelyn excused herself for medication, and Oliver rushed off to school. The apartment became quiet. Nathaniel set down his teacup. "You're wondering why I came?" Clara crossed her arms lightly. "A little." He looked toward the window. "When I was 14, my father lost everything." That surprised her. Public magazines described Nathaniel as old money royalty. Not struggle. "We moved into a one-bedroom flat above a grocery shop," he continued. "My mother worked constantly. People who once respected my father stopped returning his calls." Clara listened carefully. "I remember how quickly the world changes when you no longer appear successful," he said. "People become colder. Less patient. Less kind." His eyes met hers. "You reminded me of that last night." Clara softened slightly. "So this is charity?" "No." His answer came immediately. "This is respect." Silence lingered between them. Then Nathaniel reached into his coat pocket and handed her a business card. "I'd like to offer you a position at Ashford International." Clara blinked in shock. "What?" "Our community development division needs a project coordinator. Amelia mentioned you handled event logistics for several charities." She exaggerated. "She praised you honestly." Clara stared at the card. The salary alone would change her family's life. "But you barely know me." Nathaniel gave a small smile. "Then prove I'm making the right decision." 2 months later, Clara still sometimes paused outside Ashford International headquarters just to convince herself it was real. The building towered above central London like polished glass and steel ambition. And somehow, she worked there. At first, people assumed she received special treatment because of Nathaniel. Rumors spread quickly. Some employees whispered that she was secretly dating him. Others assumed she was another temporary fascination. But Clara ignored them. She worked harder than anyone. She arrived early, stayed late, solved problems calmly, and treated everyone respectfully, from executives to cleaners. And gradually, people stopped doubting her. Nathaniel watched all of it quietly. He never hovered around her office. Never used his position to create gossip. If anything, he became more careful around her professionally. But sometimes, during long meetings, Clara would catch him watching her with thoughtful eyes. Noticing her. One evening, nearly 3 months after the gala, Clara remained late organizing files for a housing charity project. Most of the office lights had dimmed already. She rubbed her tired eyes when a voice spoke nearby. "You missed dinner." Nathaniel stood by her office doorway holding 2 takeaway containers. Clara smiled despite herself. Are you secretly monitoring employees? Only the stubborn ones. He set the food down across from her. She laughed softly. It amazed her how natural things felt with him now. Not forced. Not intimidating. Easy. As they ate quietly, Nathaniel glanced toward the project folders. You care about this work. I know what instability feels like, Clara said. When your home feels uncertain, everything feels uncertain. Nathaniel nodded slowly. That's why you're good at this. The office lights reflected softly against the windows overlooking the city. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Nathaniel asked quietly, why did you really ask me to pretend that night? Clara looked down at her food. Because the truth still embarrassed her. Finally she answered. I didn't want Elliot to see how broken I felt. Nathaniel's expression softened. And now? She thought carefully before replying. Now I don't think I'm broken. His eyes never left hers. You never were. The words settled somewhere deep inside her. Dangerously deep. Weeks passed. Then months. And somewhere between shared coffees, long meetings, quiet conversations, and small acts of kindness, Clara realized something terrifying. She was falling in love with Nathaniel Ashford. Not with the billionaire. Not with the powerful CEO. With the man who remembered how she took her tea. The man who checked on her mother's recovery. The man who secretly funded winter coats for children in one of their housing projects without telling the press. The man who listened more than he spoke. But Clara kept her feelings hidden. Because people like Nathaniel didn't truly choose people like her. Did they? Then came the company Christmas banquet. Exactly 1 year after the gala where they first met. Clara stood near the entrance greeting guests when she suddenly heard a familiar voice. Clara. She turned. Elliot. He looked older now somehow. Less confident. Less polished. Hello, Elliot. He smiled awkwardly. I heard about your promotion. Thank you. There was an uncomfortable pause. Then Elliot sighed softly. I owe you an apology. Clara blinked. For what? For the way I treated you. Back then, and at the gala. She studied him carefully. For the first time, he seemed genuine. I was selfish, he admitted. I cared too much about status. About appearances. Clara remained quiet. Elliot looked around the elegant venue. You know, he said sadly, I spent years chasing successful people because I thought success would make me feel important. His eyes returned to hers. But I've never met anyone stronger than you. The old Clara would have cried hearing that. But this version of Clara simply smiled gently. I hope you find happiness, Elliot. And she meant it. Not because she still loved him. But because she no longer needed his regret to validate her worth. As Elliot walked away, Nathaniel approached from across the ballroom. You look lighter, he observed. Clara laughed softly. I think I finally stopped carrying old pain. Nathaniel seemed relieved by that answer. Then the evening continued. Speeches were made. Awards presented. Music played. And eventually Nathaniel stepped onto the stage for closing remarks. The entire ballroom quieted instantly. Nathaniel rarely spoke emotionally in public. Most expected another formal business speech. Instead, he looked directly toward Clara. And suddenly, her heartbeat stumbled. 1 year ago, Nathaniel began calmly, I attended an event because I believed responsibility mattered more than connection. The audience listened closely. I thought success meant efficiency. Control. Distance. His gaze remained fixed on Clara. Then someone reminded me that kindness changes lives more powerfully than status ever will. Clara felt her breath catch. Nathaniel stepped down from the stage. then slowly walked toward her in front of hundreds of guests. The room became completely silent. When he finally stood before her, his voice softened. "That night, you asked me to pretend." Clara's heart pounded. Nathaniel smiled gently. But somewhere along the way, pretending became impossible. Several guests quietly gasped. Clara felt tears fill her eyes instantly. Nathaniel reached for her hand carefully. "Clara Whitmore," he said, "you taught me that love isn't built through perfection. It's built through compassion, patience, honesty, and showing up when someone needs you." Her vision blurred completely now. "I don't want to act anymore." The ballroom disappeared around her. There was only him. Only this moment. Only the impossible warmth filling her chest. Nathaniel's expression held none of the cold distance newspapers described. Only sincerity. Only hope. "I love you," he said quietly. "Truly." Clara laughed through tears. Not elegant tears. Not cinematic tears. Real ones. Because after everything life had taken from her, she had stopped believing gentle things could last. Yet here stood a man who had seen her at her lowest moment and responded not with judgment, but with kindness. And kindness had changed everything. Clara squeezed his hand tightly. "I love you too." The ballroom erupted into applause around them, but neither seemed to notice. Months later, Clara stood beside Nathaniel on the balcony of their new community housing project opening ceremony. Children laughed nearby while families toured the finished apartments. Her mother looked healthier than she had in years. Oliver kicked a football around the courtyard with volunteers. And Nathaniel stood beside Clara with the same calm warmth he had shown her from the very beginning. Not once had he tried to erase her past. Not once had he treated her struggle like something shameful. Instead, he had helped her see strength where she once saw failure. As cameras flashed below, Clara leaned gently against him. "You know," she said softly, "if I hadn't panicked at that gala, none of this would have happened." Nathaniel smiled. "You were brave that night." "I was desperate." "Sometimes," he replied, "people become brave because they're desperate." She looked out over the families receiving keys to their new homes. People crying with relief. Children smiling with excitement. Parents hugging each other tightly. Hope living quietly in ordinary moments. And Clara finally understood something important. The greatest changes in life rarely begin with grand victories. Sometimes they begin with a trembling voice asking for kindness. Sometimes they begin when someone chooses compassion instead of judgment. And sometimes, the people who rescue us are simply the ones who remind us that we were worthy of love all along.